It's sometime in the late 1800s, high up in the Hindu Kush Mountains, in one of the most remote and dangerous mountain ranges on Earth, and a British colonial officer is trekking through a narrow valley in what is now northern Pakistan. He's exhausted, he's far from any outpost, and he's expecting to find exactly what he's found in every other valley in the region: dark-haired, dark-eyed mountain communities living under strict Islamic customs. Instead, he walks into a village and freezes. Standing in front of him are people with light brown and blonde hair, people with green and blue eyes, people wearing elaborate hand-woven black robes with colorful embroidery, dancing to music, drinking wine openly, worshipping multiple gods instead of one, doing absolutely nothing that matches what he expected to find in this part of the world. For a European man standing in one of the most isolated mountain ranges on the planet, thousands of miles from Europe, this must have felt like stumbling into an impossible place. Who were these people? Where did they come from? How did they end up here, isolated in valleys accessible only by treacherous mountain paths, holding onto a completely different religion, a completely different language, and a completely different physical appearance than every single group living around them? The locals had their own explanation, one they'd been repeating for generations. They were the descendants of Alexander the Great's soldiers, left behind more than 2,000 years earlier when the greatest conqueror in ancient history marched his army through these very mountains on his way to India. For over 2,300 years, that legend survived, passed down through generations, believed by outsiders and insiders alike, printed in newspapers, repeated in documentaries, treated almost as historical fact. But here's the twist. Modern DNA science has now gone deep into the genetic code of these people, and what it found is stranger, older, and far more complicated than the Alexander the Great legend ever suggested. Stick with me, because this is one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in human genetics. And the real answer took scientists decades, multiple competing studies, and some seriously advanced technology to finally untangle. The people in that valley are called the Kalash, sometimes written as Kalasha, and today they number only around 4,000 individuals, making them one of the smallest and most endangered ethnic and religious minorities left on Earth. They live tucked away in 3 narrow valleys in the Hindu Kush Mountains of northern Pakistan, close to the Afghan border, in some of the most physically isolated terrain imaginable, surrounded almost entirely by Muslim populations who look, dress, worship, and live completely differently than they do. The Kalash are polytheistic, meaning they worship multiple gods and goddesses, rather than one single god. A religious tradition that has survived in this one small pocket of mountains for centuries, despite intense pressure, conversion efforts, and cultural erosion from every direction around them. They speak Kalasha, a unique Indo-European language found nowhere else on Earth in quite the same form. And physically, a noticeable portion of the Kalash population displays lighter hair and eye colors, sometimes blonde or light brown hair, sometimes green or blue eyes, features that stand out dramatically against the overwhelmingly darker hair and eye coloring of the surrounding Pakistani and Afghan populations nearby. For centuries, that physical contrast alone was enough to fuel wild speculation about where the Kalash actually came from, and the most famous theory, repeated constantly by the Kalash themselves and by countless outside observers, ties directly back to one of history's most legendary military campaigns. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great led his Macedonian army through this exact region of the world during his invasion of India, one of the most ambitious military campaigns in ancient history. According to popular legend, when Alexander's forces eventually turned back toward home, some soldiers, either too exhausted, too wounded, or simply unwilling to continue the brutal campaign, supposedly stayed behind, settling permanently in these remote mountain valleys, marrying local women, and quietly founding what would eventually become the Kalash people. For over 2,000 years, this story has been repeated as an almost unquestioned piece of regional folklore. Kalash elders, according to reporting on their oral traditions, have specifically referenced a figure they call Shalakash, believed by some to have been one of Alexander's generals who supposedly settled in the region after the Greek armies withdrew. Some historians have even speculated that this name might actually be a garbled folk memory of Seleucus Nicator, one of Alexander's actual historical generals, who genuinely did go on to rule over territories in this general region after Alexander's death. Supporters of the theory also point to certain Kalash deity names that sound similar to Greek gods, and scattered words within the Kalasha language that appear to resemble ancient Greek vocabulary. Add to that the light hair and eyes, the wine-drinking traditions, and a general cultural feel that outsiders have long described as strikingly different from the surrounding Islamic communities, and you can understand exactly why the Alexander the Great legend took hold so powerfully, and why it survived essentially unchallenged for over 2,000 years. But here's the problem. None of that evidence, the deity names, the scattered vocabulary, the light features, the cultural differences, is actual scientific proof of anything. It's circumstantial. It's the kind of evidence that feels compelling on the surface, but completely falls apart the moment you apply rigorous genetic testing. And starting in the early 2000s, that's exactly what scientists finally did. The first wave of serious genetic research into Kalash origins began digging specifically into their Y chromosome DNA, which traces direct paternal lineage, father to son, across countless generations, and their mitochondrial DNA, which traces the direct maternal line instead. A 2007 genetic analysis examining the Y chromosomes of 44 Kalash individuals found a striking mix of different paternal haplogroups present within the population, including significant percentages linked to lineages found across South Asia, West Asia, and parts of Central Asia. Crucially, researchers found essentially no meaningful presence of the specific Y chromosome haplogroup most strongly associated with ancient Greek and Macedonian populations. If genuine Greek soldiers had settled in these valleys and become significant ancestors of the modern Kalash population, you would expect to find at least some detectable trace of that specific ancient Greek paternal signature showing up reasonably often in the male lineage today. It largely wasn't there. This was the first serious scientific crack in the Alexander the Great legend, but it certainly wasn't the last word on the subject, because just a few years later, a completely different study appeared to suggest something much more interesting was actually going on beneath the surface. In 2014, a team of geneticists conducting a broader analysis of global population genetics identified something unexpected buried within Kalash DNA. Using statistical techniques designed to detect and date ancient admixture events, moments in history when two previously separate populations mixed their genetics together, researchers found evidence that the Kalash experienced a genuine mixing event with a population carrying Western Eurasian genetic ancestry sometime between roughly 900 and 210 BC. That date range, especially the later end of it, lines up almost eerily well with the timing of Alexander the Great's actual invasion of this exact region in 327 and 326 BC. When this finding made headlines, it briefly reignited the entire Alexander the Great theory with fresh scientific credibility, generating excited news coverage suggesting that after over 2,000 years of legend, DNA had finally proven the ancient story true. For a moment, it genuinely looked like the mystery had been solved, and the Kalash truly were, at least in part, the descendants of a lost fragment of one of history's most famous armies. But science rarely stays settled for long, especially when new, more advanced tools become available, and that's exactly what happened next. In 2015, a much more comprehensive and technically rigorous study, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics and led by geneticist Qasim Ayub, working alongside researchers from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in Cambridge, took an even deeper look, this time analyzing full autosomal genetic data, not just the more limited Y chromosome and mitochondrial markers used in earlier research, from 23 Kalash individuals sampled across 3 separate valleys. And this study delivered a genuinely dramatic twist. According to this more advanced genetic analysis, there was no meaningful support at all for the theory that the Kalash descend from Alexander's Greek soldiers. Instead, the data revealed something scientists hadn't fully expected. The Kalash showed strong genetic drift connections to ancient Paleolithic Siberian hunter-gatherers, populations that lived tens of thousands of years ago in what's now Siberia. Long before Alexander the Great, long before ancient Greece even existed as a civilization, long before most recorded human history had even begun. According to this research, the Kalash appeared to represent an extremely drifted, deeply isolated remnant of an ancient northern Eurasian population, one of the same deep ancestral branches that also contributed genetic material to populations across both Europe and the Near East. In other words, instead of being the recent descendants of a 2,300-year-old army, the Kalash may actually be carrying genetic threads reaching back tens of thousands of years, connecting them not to Alexander's Macedonian soldiers at all, but to some of the oldest known human population branches in northern Eurasia. And there's an even more remarkable detail buried inside this same 2015 research. Scientists studying Kalash population history calculated their long-term effective population size, essentially an estimate of how many breeding individuals have contributed to the gene pool across countless generations, and found it sitting at a strikingly small number somewhere between roughly 2,300 and 2,600 people. For an entire population's genetic diversity across thousands of years of history, that's an extraordinarily small number, and it points directly to one of the most extreme sustained cases of genetic isolation ever documented in a human population. According to this same research, since splitting off from other South Asian populations at some point in ancient history, the Kalash have experienced essentially no detectable gene flow, meaning no meaningful genetic mixing from their immediate geographic neighbors in Pakistan, and no meaningful mixing from any other surrounding Eurasian populations either. Think about what that actually means. For thousands of years, while empires rose and fell around them, while Alexander's armies marched through, while Islamic conquest swept across the entire surrounding region, while trade routes connected distant civilizations across the Silk Road just miles from their valleys, The Kalash somehow remained genetically sealed off, marrying almost exclusively within their own small, isolated community, generation after generation after generation, creating one of the most extreme and scientifically fascinating genetic bottlenecks ever recorded in any human population on Earth. This kind of extreme, prolonged isolation happens almost nowhere else in human history at this scale, and it explains an enormous amount about why the Kalash look, sound, and live so differently from everyone around them. When a population stays isolated and genetically sealed off for thousands of years, rare genetic traits that might otherwise get diluted by mixing with outside populations instead stay concentrated and amplified within that smaller gene pool, generation after generation. This is very likely a huge part of why traits like lighter hair and eye color, genuinely rare and unusual traits for this specific geographic region of the world, have persisted and remained visible within the Kalash population at noticeably higher rates than in any of the surrounding communities, not necessarily because of a dramatic infusion of Greek or European ancestry at all, but simply because thousands of years of extreme genetic isolation allowed certain ancient, rare traits already present deep in their gene pool to remain concentrated, rather than getting genetically diluted out over time the way they typically would in a larger, more genetically connected population. There's also a serious medical side effect to this level of extreme, sustained isolation that researchers have paid close attention to, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. When a population as small as the Kalash marries almost exclusively within its own community for thousands of consecutive years, the risk of certain recessive genetic conditions appearing at higher rates than normal increases significantly, simply because closely related genetic lines keep intersecting generation after generation. Small, isolated populations like the Kalash are often studied by medical geneticists, specifically because they offer a rare natural laboratory for understanding how certain rare genetic conditions behave when a population's overall gene pool stays this tightly concentrated for such an extraordinarily long stretch of time. It's one of the quieter, less dramatic sides of this story, but it's a real and important part of what extreme isolation actually means for a living, breathing community. Not just an interesting historical curiosity, but something that shapes the everyday health realities of Kalash families even today. So where does that leave the actual origin story? If it's not Alexander the Great's soldiers, and if it's not a simple recent mixing event with ancient Europeans, then who exactly are the Kalash, and where did they actually come from originally? This is where the mystery gets genuinely complicated, because different studies, using different genetic tools and different statistical methods, have produced somewhat different conclusions. And even recent research published as late as this year has acknowledged that the full picture still isn't completely settled. A more recent phylogenetic study analyzing both autosomal and Y chromosome genetic markers found that the Kalash display a genuinely unique genetic structure that sets them apart clearly from broader Asian, European, and African reference populations, while their Y chromosome haplogroups specifically connect them to what researchers describe as an ancient Eurasian Indo-Iranian population branch. Other genetic analyses have identified specific Y DNA haplogroups within the Kalash population, including lineages labeled G2A2, J2B2A, and R1A Z93, all of which are strongly associated with ancient Neolithic and Indo-Iranian population movements that swept across this broader region of Central and South Asia thousands of years before Alexander the Great was ever born. Taken together, the strongest current scientific consensus suggests the Kalash are most likely a pre-Islamic Indo-Aryan population, descended from ancient migrations of Indo-Iranian-speaking peoples who moved into this region of South Asia thousands of years ago, who then became isolated in these specific mountain valleys and remained genetically and culturally sealed off from the dramatic religious, political, and demographic changes that transformed almost every other population around them over the following millennia, including the massive wave of Islamic conversion that eventually reshaped nearly the entire surrounding region. Interestingly, the Kalash themselves have their own separate origin legend that has nothing to do with Alexander the Great at all, one that gets far less international attention, but that many Kalash elders consider just as important, if not more important, than the Greek soldier story. According to this oral tradition, their distant ancestors originally came from a legendary homeland called Siam, a place some researchers have speculated might correspond loosely to somewhere in Southeast Asia, though its exact real-world location, if it even corresponds to a real place at all, remains completely unknown and unconfirmed. This alternate legend rarely makes headlines compared to the far more dramatic and internationally appealing Alexander the Great story, but it's a powerful reminder that the Kalash people's own understanding of their history has never actually been a single, simple narrative. Even within their own oral traditions, there have long been multiple, sometimes contradictory stories about where they truly came from, layered on top of each other across countless generations, which honestly mirrors exactly what modern genetic science eventually found too. A population whose true origins are simply more complicated, more ancient, and more layered than any single clean legend could ever fully capture. It's also worth pointing out that the Kalash are far from the only community in this general region of the world to claim descent from Alexander the Great's soldiers. Several other groups scattered across the mountainous borderlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan have made similar claims over the centuries, using their own distinct physical features, cultural practices, or oral traditions as supposed evidence. This pattern reveals something genuinely interesting about human psychology and cultural memory. When a population looks or lives noticeably differently from its neighbors, and no clear, satisfying local explanation exists, people across many different cultures and eras have consistently reached for the most famous, most dramatic historical figure available to explain that difference, rather than accepting a more complicated, harder to verify answer involving ancient migrations and thousands of years of gradual isolation. Alexander the Great, as the single most legendary conqueror to ever pass through this exact region, became the natural explanation reached for again and again, not just by the Kalash, but by multiple distinct communities scattered across this same mountainous frontier, each one building its own version of essentially the same legend around the same historical figure. Now, here's where this story takes on an even more urgent dimension, because understanding where the Kalash came from genetically isn't just an academic curiosity anymore. It's connected directly to a genuine, real-world crisis facing this tiny population today. With only around 4,000 Kalash individuals left on Earth, this already incredibly small population is under serious, mounting pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Religious conversion efforts, both formal and informal, have steadily pulled Kalash individuals and entire families out of their traditional polytheistic faith and into surrounding Islamic communities for generations, a process that has only accelerated with increased modern connectivity, economic pressure, and social influence from the much larger populations surrounding their valleys. Modernization itself, roads, phones, migration to cities for work and education, has also steadily eroded traditional Kalash cultural practices, language use, and community cohesion, the very things that allowed this population to remain so distinctly separate for thousands of years in the first place. International organizations and cultural preservation groups have specifically intensified efforts in recent years to help protect and document Kalash heritage before it potentially disappears entirely, including renewed pushes toward securing formal UNESCO cultural recognition aimed at drawing global attention and resources toward preserving what remains one of the most genetically and culturally unique populations left on the entire planet. In a very real sense, scientists studying Kalash DNA aren't just solving a 2,300-year-old historical mystery for curiosity's sake. They're racing against time to document and understand an extraordinarily rare genetic and cultural lineage before the forces of modernization and assimilation potentially erase it completely within just a few more generations. There's also something genuinely humbling buried inside this entire scientific journey, something that goes beyond just the Kalash specifically. For over 2,000 years, an entire civilization built its identity, at least in part, around a single, unverified legend. A story about Alexander the Great's soldiers that felt emotionally satisfying, tied them symbolically to one of history's greatest conquerors, and gave outside observers a simple, dramatic explanation for why this one small mountain population looked so strikingly different from everyone surrounding them. And when modern genetic science first appeared to confirm pieces of that ancient story back in 2014, it felt, for a brief moment, like one of history's oldest legends had finally been scientifically vindicated after 23 centuries of doubt. But then, more advanced, more rigorous testing came along just 1 year later and completely overturned that conclusion, revealing a story that reached back not 2,300 years, but potentially tens of thousands of years, connecting the Kalash not to Macedonian soldiers, but to some of the most ancient human population branches known to modern science. It's a powerful reminder of just how much scientific understanding can shift as technology improves, and how a population's own deeply held beliefs about their origins, no matter how many generations have repeated and reinforced that story, can turn out to be completely disconnected from what their actual DNA reveals underneath. And yet, even with all of this modern genetic evidence essentially disproving the Alexander the Great legend at the DNA level, most Kalash people today, according to researchers who have spent years studying and documenting this community, continue to take genuine pride in their claimed connection to Alexander the Great, regardless of what the scientific data actually shows. Local authorities and outside researchers generally don't push hard to correct or challenge this deeply held cultural belief, and many Kalash elders continue passing the story down to younger generations, essentially unchanged, treating it less as a literal, provable historical fact and more as a cherished piece of cultural identity that has helped bind their small, endangered community together for over 2,000 years. Every year, the Kalash continue holding their traditional seasonal festivals, vibrant, colorful celebrations filled with music, dancing, and centuries-old rituals tied to their ancient polytheistic beliefs, events that have increasingly attracted curious tourists and researchers from around the world, all drawn by that same lingering mystery of who these remarkable mountain people truly are, and where their extraordinary, isolated bloodline genuinely traces back to. In many ways, that's honestly a fitting final note to this entire mystery. The DNA evidence increasingly suggests the Kalash are the isolated remnants of one of the oldest, most genetically ancient population branches still surviving anywhere in Eurasia today, a genuinely astonishing scientific discovery on its own. But the legend of Alexander the Great's lost soldiers, even though modern genetics has largely dismantled it as a literal explanation, still lives on inside Kalash villages today, not because it's scientifically accurate, but because after 2,300 years, it has become something arguably even more powerful than historical fact. It's become part of who they are. So picture that British officer again, standing frozen in that remote mountain valley more than a century ago, staring at people who looked like they belonged somewhere else entirely, wearing black, embroidered robes, drinking wine, worshipping gods with names nobody outside these mountains had ever heard, and surrounded by dramatic peaks that had kept the outside world at bay for thousands of years. He had no idea that the explanation everyone around him would confidently offer, Alexander the Great's lost soldiers, would still be debated by scientists more than 100 years later, using tools and technology nobody in that century could have possibly imagined. And he certainly had no idea that the real answer, when it finally arrived through advanced DNA sequencing more than a century after his visit, would turn out to be even stranger and even older than any ancient conqueror's legend. A population so deeply isolated, so genetically sealed off, that their true roots stretch back not to a famous army from 23 centuries ago, but potentially to some of the oldest surviving human genetic lineages left anywhere on the entire planet, quietly hidden in 3 narrow valleys in the Hindu Kush the entire time, waiting over 2,000 years for science to finally catch up with the mystery and reminding us, in the process, that sometimes the truth buried in our blood is even more remarkable than the legends we tell ourselves to explain it